She stood in my driveway, watching the Child Protective Services worker escort my confused 4-year-old daughter into the house, and she actually smiled. I didn't cry. I took action. 72 hours later, her pristine social standing, her iron grip on our family, and her financial security collapsed into dust, and she never saw it coming. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, always looked at me not as a daughter-in-law, but as an incubator who had overstayed her welcome. When I married her son, Greg, I didn't realize I was marrying into a hierarchy where I would forever remain at the absolute bottom. Greg was the golden child. He could do no wrong, make no financial error, and bear no personal responsibility. Eleanor had spent 30 years curating his life to ensure he never had to face the consequences of his own actions, which naturally meant that whenever something went wrong in our household, the blame was seamlessly and permanently transferred to me. For the first 5 years of our marriage, I swallowed my pride daily. I convinced myself that this was simply what family required. I absorbed her backhanded compliments about my weight, my cooking, and my career as a freelance graphic designer, which she loudly and repeatedly referred to as my little computer hobby. I endured the way she would rearrange my kitchen cabinets while I was at work, throwing away spices she deemed too ethnic, or organizing my pantry to her impossible, clan, Eichel standards. I thought if I just compromised enough, if I was just accommodating enough, she would eventually accept me. I didn't realize that accommodating a narcissist is like pouring water into a black hole. It doesn't fill them up, it just exhausts your supply. The real friction began when my daughter, Lily, was born. Suddenly, Eleanor's subtle jabs evolved into aggressive territorial disputes. She would show up unannounced at our house at 7 in the morning, demanding to take the baby for the day. When I politely declined, citing Lily's feeding schedule, the gaslighting would commence. She would look at Greg with tear-filled eyes, claiming I was trying to isolate her from her only grandchild, twisting my simple desire for a healthy routine into a malicious plot against her. And Greg, conditioned by decades of emotional manipulation, would sigh and tell me to just let her have her way to keep the peace. I lived in that exhausting cycle until the month Greg abruptly decided he wanted a divorce. He didn't want custody, of course. That would require actual work and sacrifice. He just wanted a clean break to find himself with a 24-year-old yoga instructor he had met at his gym. Eleanor, however, saw the divorce not as a family tragedy, but as a golden opportunity. In her twisted logic, with Greg out of the house, I was no longer a necessary obstacle. She decided that Lily belonged exclusively to her bloodline, and she began a systematic campaign to prove I was an unfit mother, so she could petition for grandparents' rights and primary guardianship. It started with small, insidious things. She began keeping a notebook, a small, black, leather-bound journal that she would ostentatiously wield whenever we happened to be in the same room. I would catch her peering through my living room window from the street, jotting things down. She started questioning Lily's pediatrician behind my back, trying to access private medical records. I later discovered she had been calling my neighbors, asking if they heard loud shouting from my house or if they noticed me drinking heavily, laying the meticulous groundwork for a devastating smear campaign. Her audacity was breathtaking. She was attempting to rewrite my reality, to paint a picture of a negligent, unhinged woman, entirely ignoring the fact that I was the sole provider and caretaker for my child Will. Her son was off financing his midlife crisis. Looking back, I realized the profound danger of what I was doing during those years. I was practicing a form of emotional endurance that I completely mistook for strength. We are often taught that keeping the peace is a virtue, especially within families. But when you are dealing with a deeply toxic system, keeping the peace is just slow self-destruction with a polite name. You begin to compromise your own reality to avoid their wrath. You start believing that if you just explain yourself a little better, they will understand. But you cannot reason with someone who benefits from misunderstanding you. Their entire power relies on your compliance. They use your empathy as a weapon against you, knowing you will bend over backwards to prove you aren't the monster they are accusing you of being. The guilt you feel, the constant nagging worry that maybe you were doing something wrong as a mother, is actually shame they have surgically projected onto you. They make you feel like you are fundamentally broken, so you will never trust your own instincts enough to fight back. My instincts finally kicked in on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was in the middle of a client call when the doorbell rang. Standing on my porch was a woman with a clipboard and a badge, introducing herself as a social worker from the county's Child Protective Services Division. She stated they had received an anonymous, urgent tip from a highly concerned citizen. The report alleged that my house was littered with hazardous materials, that there was no edible food in the refrigerator, and that my daughter was frequently left unsupervised while I engaged in illicit substance abuse. I felt my stomach drop to the floor. Across the street, parked in the shadow of a large oak tree, I saw the familiar silver Lexus SUV. Eleanor was sitting in the driver's seat, watching the scene unfold with an expression of serene satisfaction. She had finally pulled the trigger. She had crossed the ultimate line, weaponizing the state against me to steal my child. I invited the social worker inside. I offered her coffee. I kept my voice steady, though my hands were trembling slightly under the table, an imperfect reaction to a perfect nightmare. I walked her through the house, opening cabinets fully stocked with fresh produce, showing her Lily's immaculate bedroom, and answering her questions. I didn't know it then, but what the social worker documented in her notebook that day was the exact ammunition I needed to dismantle Eleanor's life permanently. What I've told you so far is how they broke me down. What comes next is how I built back differently. The social worker, a no-nonsense woman named Brenda, spent exactly 45 minutes in my home. She checked the pantry. She looked under the bathroom sinks for unsecured chemicals. She sat on the living room floor and asked Lily what her favorite dinner was. Lily babbled happily about the homemade chicken stew we'd had the night before. Brenda took copious notes. When she finally closed her heavy leather folder, she let out a long, slow exhale. She looked at me with professional exhaustion and profound pity. "I have to follow up on every single call we get," Brenda said quietly. "But I can tell you right now, this report is going to be filed as utterly unfounded. Someone is trying to use my agency as a weapon to hurt you." My blood ran cold. Hearing a state official validate the nightmare I was living in was paralyzing. I didn't cry. I took action. I explained the impending divorce. I explained Eleanor's escalating behavior. Brenda nodded grimly, handing me her business card. She instructed me on how to request a certified copy of the closed case file. That piece of paper, an official state document clearing me of all negligence, was the first brick in the fortress I was about to build. Eleanor and Greg had made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed that because I had been quiet for 5 years, I was weak. But silence isn't always submission. Sometimes, it's just the time you take to gather your ammunition. The next morning, I didn't open my laptop. I dropped Lily off at her preschool, kissed her forehead, and drove straight to the most aggressive family law attorney in the county. It wasn't a perfect cinematic moment. I had barely slept. I had spilled coffee on my white blouse on the drive over, and my stomach was in knots. But the moment I sat across from the lawyer, a ruthless woman named Miller, the fear evaporated, replaced by a cold focus. I laid everything out. The sudden divorce, the 24-year-old yoga instructor Greg was parading around, the devastating CPS visit, and Eleanor's obsessive campaign to strip me of my child. Miller listened. Then, she leaned back and asked the one question that changed the entire trajectory of my life: who holds the deed to the house? I let out a short, humorless laugh. Here is the part of the story where Eleanor's arrogance truly blinded her. She had spent half a decade belittling my career, loudly dismissing it as my little computer hobby. Because I worked from a home office, she assumed I made pennies. What she and Greg willfully ignored was that my freelance design business had evolved into a highly lucrative boutique branding agency. I was managing the visual identities of mid-sized tech startups across the West Coast. When Greg and I got married, his credit was abysmal. He had tried to launch a bespoke craft brewery, a vanity project that Eleanor largely funded and which failed within 14 months. Because of his financial ruin, no bank would give us a mortgage together. So I bought our 4-bedroom house entirely in my name, funneling the purchase through an LLC I had established 2 years before we even met. Greg never contributed a dime to the mortgage. He bought the groceries and paid the internet bill, genuinely viewing his meager contributions as monumental, masculine sacrifices. Miller smiled a terrifying, predatory smile. "So he has no equity in the property?" He has an established, documented history of financial instability, admitted infidelity, and his mother just filed a fraudulent CPS report against the primary caregiver. This is where I learned the most vital lesson about protecting yourself from toxic family systems. A paper trail is not just a stack of receipts. It is an impenetrable shield made of facts. When you are dealing with manipulative people, they will spin elaborate webs of lies to rewrite history. They will manipulate emotions, twist your words, and weaponize your guilt. But financial abuse is still abuse, and it leaves a permanent, undeniable evidence trail. You cannot gaslight a bank statement. You cannot manipulate a property deed. And you certainly cannot argue with a time-stamped, state-issued CPS report clearing a mother of all charges. The real cost of keeping it in the family is that the truth gets buried under toxic loyalty. If you want to survive, you must document your reality outside of their control. A legal document signed before the conflict even begins is the most basic, essential form of self-preservation. For the next 3 weeks, I played my part flawlessly. I played the devastated, weeping wife. I let Greg pack his clothes. I listened silently to his speeches about how we had just grown apart and how he needed space to explore his authentic truth. I didn't fight him. I didn't beg him to stay. I just watched him load his golf clubs into his car, knowing full well he was moving into a luxury downtown apartment that Alina had co-signed for him. Meanwhile, Alina's smear campaign went into maximum overdrive. She sent a mass, dramatic email to Greg's entire extended family, vaguely claiming I was having a mental break. She formally petitioned the family court for emergency temporary guardianship of Lily, banking on the fact that I wouldn't have the resources to fight back. She scheduled a mandatory mediation session to force my surrender. She chose a rainy Tuesday morning in October. She chose the enormous glass-walled conference room at her own highly expensive attorney's office, wanting the absolute home field advantage to intimidate me. I let her truly believe she had finally won, but what she didn't realize as she sat down across from me with that smug smile was that I hadn't come to mediate. For 5 years, I absorbed everything quietly, believing peace was worth the price of my dignity. That ends here. The conference room at Alina's attorney's office was designed to intimidate. It was a massive, sterile expanse of glass and polished mahogany on the 14th floor, overlooking the gray, rain-soaked city. I walked in 2 minutes late. It wasn't a power move. I had genuinely struggled to find parking in the garage, and my heel had caught in the elevator grate, scuffing the leather. It was an imperfect detail on a day I wanted to be flawless, but I forced my breathing to slow. Alina was already seated at the head of the table. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer and a look of absolute, radiant triumph. Greg sat next to her, scrolling through his phone. He looked entirely detached from the undeniable fact that we were discussing the permanent custody of his only child. His lawyer, a silver-haired man named Vance, looked over his reading glasses at me with an expression of mild, irritated boredom. My attorney, Miller, sat beside me and quietly unclasped her leather briefcase. The sharp, metallic click echoed in the quiet room. Well, Alina began, not waiting for the lawyers to formally open the mediation session. Her voice dripped with that familiar, cloying false sympathy she used to manipulate strangers. I am glad you decided to be reasonable and show up. We all know you are struggling, and there is absolutely no shame in admitting you cannot handle motherhood alone. Greg and I are prepared to offer you generous weekend visitation, provided you agree to seek the intensive psychiatric help you clearly need. This is purely about what is best for Lily. She pushed a thick stack of papers, her proposed custody agreement, across the wood. I didn't reach for it. I kept my voice steady, locking my eyes with hers. I don't need your schedule, Alina, and I certainly don't need your version of reality. Vance cleared his throat, attempting to intervene professionally. Now, let's keep emotions out of this. My client is offering a very fair, equitable. Your client, Miller interrupted, her voice cutting through the room like a surgical scalpel, is offering a settlement based entirely on a fraudulent, fabricated premise. We are not here to negotiate custody today. We are here to finalize the unconditional terms of your client's surrender. Alina let out a sharp, mocking scoff. Surrender? You are completely delusional. Miller didn't blink once. She smoothly slid a single, blue-stamped folder across the table, stopping it in front of Aliner's hands. Exhibit A, Miller stated coldly. The certified, closed investigation report from County Child Protective Services, time-stamped at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. The agency found zero evidence of neglect or abuse. Furthermore, the investigating social worker officially noted the anonymous, urgent tip as malicious, coordinated, and retaliatory harassment. We have already subpoenaed the localized cell tower records tracing that specific phone call directly to your landline, Aliner. Aliner's hand hovered over the folder. She didn't open it. Their faces went pale. The arrogant flush completely drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a stark, sickly, ashen gray. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a dry, pitiful clicking sound came out. She looked desperately at Greg, but he had finally put his phone down, staring at his mother in absolute, horrified disbelief. He had been completely unaware of the vicious CPS call. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the heavy autumn rain lashing violently against the windows. Aliner finally sputtered, her voice entirely losing its polished, aristocratic edge. You manipulated them. You must have hidden the mess before she arrived. No, I replied softly. I just stopped hiding you. This is the moment I learned the most profound truth about boundaries. Boundaries are not a punishment you inflict on other people. They are simply a factual description of what you will and will not accept in your life. Enforcing them is not cruelty. It is clarity. When you finally stop absorbing their toxic behavior, they will inevitably accuse you of being aggressive, because your refusal to be a silent victim feels like a direct attack to their profound entitlement. The only way to win is to remove their access to you completely. Vance, realizing his slam dunk case was rapidly disintegrating before his eyes, tried desperately to salvage the situation. Regardless of this unfortunate misunderstanding with the state agency, my client is still the legal father. He has a right to the marital home and primary custody based on the mother's highly unstable, unpredictable freelance income. Miller actually smiled this time. Let's talk about the marital home. Exhibit B. She placed a second document on the table. A certified copy of the property deed. As you can see, Mr. Vance, your client has no equity in the property. It is wholly owned by an LLC established by my client 2 years prior to the marriage. He has made no mortgage payments. Therefore, there is no marital home to divide. In fact, since my client changed the external locks yesterday morning, your client is officially trespassing if he attempts to return. Greg stood up. You changed the locks? All my stuff is in the garage. Your belongings were professionally packed and moved to storage this morning, I informed him quietly, sliding a brass key across the table. The first month is already paid. Aliner slammed her hand violently on the table, her composure completely shattered. You cannot do this to him. I paid for that kitchen. I paid for the landscaping. I have financial stakes in that property. Yes. The financial stakes, Miller said smoothly, pulling out a third, devastatingly thick file. What I am about to tell you is the part I almost left out. But you need to hear it. It is the exact moment Aliner realized she had finally lost everything. She didn't just lose her golden grandchild. She lost her entire hidden empire. Miller opened the third file. Exhibit C, she said, her voice dropping to a low timbre that made the massive glass-walled room feel colder. A complete, legally subpoenaed forensic accounting of your son's financial activities over the last 90 days, fully cross-referenced with your joint venture accounts. Aliner blinked, her gaze darting from the blue folder to Greg. Greg had entirely stopped breathing. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows, waiting for the lever to pull. He knew what was inside. 2 months ago, Miller continued, tracing a line on the paper, you, Aliner, co-signed a commercial loan for $400,000. The stated purpose was to seed a new tech consultancy. Because Greg has no credit, you used your primary residence, the historic estate you love so much, as the sole collateral. Aliner lifted her chin, trying to maintain her aristocratic facade. My son is a brilliant entrepreneur. I simply provided the necessary bridge capital for his vision. Your son, Miller corrected, sliding a bank ledger across the table, is a fraud. We tracked every single wire transfer. Not a single cent went to a business entity. $200,000 was wired directly to a luxury car dealership for a custom Porsche, titled exclusively in the name of a 24-year-old yoga instructor. Another $80,000 went to a high-end travel agency for a 6-month, non-refundable luxury villa rental in Bali. He didn't start a business, Alina. He mortgaged your house to finance his new life, and he left you holding the bag. I watched Alina's face as she pulled the ledger toward her. This is where the true, paralyzing horror set in for her. I fully expected her to scream. I expected her to flip the heavy table or launch into a vicious, defensive tirade blaming me. She didn't. She just sat there, very still, reading the lines twice. Her hands, weighed down by diamond rings, began to tremble violently. That silence was worse than any outburst. It was the devastating sound of a woman realizing her golden child had not only played her, but had entirely bankrupted her to impress a stranger. The illusion she had spent 30 years curating was dead. Vance, Alina's highly paid attorney, let out a slow, deeply exhausted sigh. He didn't offer a single word of defense. He simply reached out, closed his leather notepad, and clicked his gold pen shut. I cannot and will not represent you in matters of commercial bank fraud, Vance said, standing up and sharply buttoning his suit jacket. I strongly advise you both to secure separate criminal defense counsel before the close of business today. I slowly stood up to leave right then. My hand was shaking so badly from the adrenaline crash that I couldn't get my coat buttoned. I fumbled with it for a few seconds before just leaving it hanging open, a frustrating, imperfect detail on a day I wanted to be flawless. But my voice didn't shake. We are withdrawing all settlement offers, I said quietly, looking down at them. You will be hearing from the courts. They didn't collapse quietly. They collapsed loudly, messily, and in a way that exposed exactly who they had always been. Walking out of that building, I felt a massive, dizzying wave of relief, but the fallout was immediate. By the time I reached my car in the parking garage, my phone was already exploding with notifications. Alina was hysterically calling every extended family member, spinning wild, incoherent lies about how I had somehow framed Greg, begging them to send money to help save her estate from impending foreclosure. I didn't answer a single text. I drove straight home. I walked into my quiet, safe house and I packed my bags. Just 2 small suitcases for me and Lily. I booked us a quiet, secluded cabin in the mountains for the weekend. I needed to physically remove us from the blast radius of their destruction. Before turning my phone off entirely, I drafted one final, blanket email to Greg's entire extended family, attaching the closed CPS report and officially declaring permanent N.A.B. salute no contact. Sitting on the porch of that mountain cabin, listening to the wind pull through the tall pines while Lily slept safely inside, I finally had the quiet space to process what I had survived. I realized then the profound, life-altering difference between guilt and shame. For 5 years, Alina had weaponized my empathy against me. When she criticized my mothering or my career, I felt a heavy, twisting anxiety. I thought it was guilt, the natural feeling that maybe I had made a mistake and needed to do better. But guilt is feeling bad about an action. What Alina and Greg pumped into my veins was shame. Shame is the deeply implanted belief that you are fundamentally broken, that who you are is wrong. Narcissistic family systems completely rely on this distinction. They project their own deep-seated, hidden shame onto the family scapegoat, making you carry their darkness, so they don't have to face it themselves. They systematically groom you to doubt your own sanity, ensuring you will constantly work to earn the approval of the very people destroying you. Unlearning that shame isn't just a mental exercise, it is an agonizing, daily excavation of your own soul. You have to learn to trust your own eyes again. You have to realize that you were never the problem, you were just the most convenient mirror for their dysfunction. And the moment you refuse to hold that mirror up anymore, their entire false reality shatters. I thought the worst of the storm had passed. I believed that by cutting the cord and stepping away, I was finally safe from their chaos. But I grossly underestimated the desperation of a golden child who has finally been cut off from his unlimited funding. The ultimate closure didn't come from the lawyer's office. It came 4 days later, at 3 in the morning, when I was jolted awake by the sound of someone violently pounding on my front door. The pounding was so violent it rattled the glass panes in the living room windows. I bolted upright in the dark, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. It was 3 in the morning. The mountain cabin I had rented was isolated, miles away from the city, but somehow he had found us. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, my fingers slipping clumsily on the screen as I fumbled to open the security camera app I had hurriedly installed on the porch before going to bed. There he was, Greg, standing on the wooden deck in the freezing rain, absolutely drenched and completely unhinged. "I know you're in there," he screamed, his voice cracking horribly as he kicked the heavy oak door. "Open the goddamn door." "She left me. They took the car. You have to fix this." I watched him through the cold blue glow of my phone screen. The yoga instructor, predictably, had vanished the precise second the commercial fraud division froze his bank accounts and the luxury dealership repossessed the custom Porsche. Without my steady, quiet income and a leaner's bottomless credit line, Greg wasn't an attractive, misunderstood entrepreneur. He was just a bankrupt, middle-aged man with a violent temper. My thumb hovered over the microphone button on the app. Every instinct I had been brainwashed with for 5 years screamed at me to open the door, to calm him down, to protect him from the consequences of his own disastrous choices. That is the insidious, terrifying power of trauma bonding. People who have never been in a deeply toxic relationship often ask why the victim doesn't just leave, or why they keep going back. They think it's a matter of low self-esteem or weak willpower. They don't understand that trauma bonding is not a choice. It is a profound, chemical addiction to a cycle of abuse. Narcissistic systems run on intermittent reinforcement. They break you down, they starve you of affection and respect, and then, right when you are about to completely shatter, they throw you a tiny crumb of warmth or validation. Your starved brain reacts to that crumb with a massive dopamine spike. Over time, your nervous system becomes literally addicted to the extreme highs and lows. You start mistaking the relief of the abuse stopping for actual love. Even when you are finally safe, even when they have destroyed your life, a twisted part of you still views them as the only source of comfort. Watching Greg scream on my porch, my brain was fighting a chemical war. The urge to save him, to be the good wife who fixes his mess, was pulling at my bones. It takes immense, agonizing strength to rewrite that neural pathway. You have to actively choose your own survival over their comfort, every single minute of every single day, until the addiction finally breaks. I didn't open the door. I didn't press the microphone button. I bypassed the camera app entirely and dialed 911. I wish I could say the police arrived instantly, lights flashing, to carry him away like a perfectly timed scene from a movie. But we were out in the county. It took them 22 agonizing minutes to arrive. For 22 minutes, I sat on the floor of the hallway in the dark, holding my knees to my chest, listening to the men I used to love hurl vile, unspeakable insults at me throughout. The Wood, blaming me for his ruined life. When the cruiser finally pulled up the gravel driveway, the red and blue lights illuminated his wet face. He didn't try to run. He just slumped against the porch railing, defeated and shivering. "Your trespass warning was filed and served on Tuesday," I finally said, speaking calmly through the doorbell speaker as the deputies stepped out of their vehicle. "You are violating a legal order." He looked up at the camera, his eyes wide and hollow. The deputies handcuffed him without incident. They placed him in the back of the cruiser, and just like that, the specter that had haunted my life for 5 years was driven away in the dark. The fallout from that night was the final nail in the coffin of a leaner's empire. Greg's arrest for violating a restraining order and trespassing, combined with the impending commercial bank fraud charges, completely severed any remaining sympathy he had from THE extended family. Eleanor, desperate to save her golden child from a state prison sentence, liquidated whatever remaining asset she had to hire a specialized criminal defense team. It wasn't enough. Without the estate as collateral, because the bank had immediately initiated foreclosure proceedings the moment the fraud was exposed, her pristine social standing evaporated. The wealthy women at her country club stopped returning her calls. The charities she used to loudly patronize suddenly lost her contact information. Last I heard, Eleanor was renting a small, 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, working a part-time administrative job to pay off the massive legal debts Greg had AC. Crude. Greg took a restrictive plea deal to avoid jail time and is currently working off his restitution while living in her spare bedroom. They are finally trapped exactly where they belong, with each other, completely stripped of anyone else to blame. As for me, I sold the 4-bedroom house. The LLC transferred the deed, the funds cleared, and I used the money to buy a beautiful, sunlit property 2 states away, entirely out of their reach. My boutique design agency is thriving. Lily is happy, healthy, and completely oblivious to the war that was fought to protect her peace. The most important thing I can tell anyone listening to this is that people who scream the loudest about family loyalty have almost always done the least to actually earn it. They use the word family not as a bond of love, but as a chain of compliance. You are allowed to break that chain. No contact is not a dramatic, vindictive punishment. It is a medical decision. It is the surgical removal of a cancer that is actively killing your spirit. You cannot reason with people who are committed to misunderstanding you, and you cannot heal in the same environment that made you sick. Leaving quietly, legally, and permanently is the most powerful thing you can do. You don't owe your abusers an explanation, and you certainly don't owe them your sanity. I built a fortress out of facts. I survived their smear campaigns, their fraudulent reports, and their financial ruin because I refused to let my empathy blind me to their reality. I took my life back, brick by undeniable brick. So what do you think? Did I go too far or not far enough? Let me know in the comments below.